Good morning, Jackie, and
Morning.
welcome. It's good to see you at a distance digitally
Same.
and so immediately at the same
Right.
time.
Yeah.
Yeah. I welcome you back from our last discussion and enjoyed it and always enjoy our conversations. And you and I were at a meeting Friday night, and the end of our conversation was left on, we were at an AA meeting, and the end of our conversation was left on the idea of how do we employ being better in terms of mentally obsessive thinking as a action in the direction of helping in relation to people who are on the streets, homeless, in a more specific way than we normally think of it in terms of simply carrying the message. The message being there is a solution, meaning that there are people available that can help, meaning that you're not alone, nor is anyone who has any of these ideas that are fostered in the ideology of addiction is the idea that I am alone and the only thing I can do is the worst thing I can do. And the thing I do is the thing that literally is a suicidal tendency. Every compulsion is destructive. None of them
Hmm.
are, nobody is struggling with eating too much broccoli, or breathing clean air in some shallow way. It's shallow breathing that gets us and sort of is reflective of the suffocation that the press, the stress, the pressure, the indicators of doubt and disharmony and discomfort and the disease of mentally obsessive thinking. So I love that we ended on that note, because that to me is kind of where the rubber meets the road in terms of, if we have any clarity and we can become useful, how does that usefulness begin to approach what's happening today as evidence of something being seriously wrong? And with all that's being done, the problem continues to grow, indicating that perhaps the diagnosis of that problem hasn't been adequate, hasn't been correct, hasn't been accurate. And that maybe new eyes and fresh conversation could be utilized to look at it.
And I watched the TED Talk that you had suggested. And
Which was Johann Hari.
yes,
Yeah.
I love what he said that the opposite of addiction is connection.
Yeah. Well, because we're all connected. And addiction gives the false impression of disconnection so that we can isolate in thinking and think that the thinking we're doing is all that happens and all that exists. And so is the only reliable source of information, which would be a lie.
Right. I had I had a very unique situation with my addiction
I'm sure.
where everybody wanted me to keep drinking, including my own mother, because they wanted me entertaining them and drinking with them. My own wife, everybody, my best friend. I just was covered in enablers. And but something was missing for me. I needed a connection, a more, and it's my mother, my best friend, and my wife. And I wasn't connecting with them in a deep way that I needed. And it wasn't until I was searching everything. I went to Ireland. I'm like, where my ancestors are from, maybe I'll feel some connection there. And I was upset that I didn't there. I did comedy. I'm like, these are my people. And then I didn't have connection there. I was searching for, and then I did like law of attraction, and I felt a little bit of connection there, but it still wasn't right. And I never felt the connection that I felt with the 12 steps. When I got sober and my sponsor, like that was a connection that I needed. I needed that discipline and love where I had my friends just, if they saw me get upset, they handed me a drink because they knew if I had one sip of alcohol, Jackie was fun again. But if I was, not drinking and dealing with life, I was grumpy, and that was uncomfortable for them.
Yeah. Well, and what's interesting about the word discipline is that within the confines of incorrectness, that generally means punishment. And
that's what I thought. Like when I heard the word discipline, I was like, no, thank you. Like I've been avoiding discipline my whole life because the discipline that the church had was wrong. Well, in my opinion, wrong. And the discipline my parents had was off. So I didn't know that discipline was a good word.
Well, and what's interesting about it is that it effectively means practice.
Right. So in that way, that's how I feel like so much compassion for people who don't understand, that are looking for connection and are getting it in ways that are not healthy. I feel passionately about real connection. Because even there's people out there that, that we think, we're told that connection is the right connection, and it's I'm told, listen to my mother. If I was listening to my mother, I'd be drinking.
Right. So enabling is basically an addiction.
Right. Absolutely.
It's a mental addiction. And
right.
What addiction always promises is a broken promise. Always. So what you get is the opposite of what you're claiming. The solution becomes the problem when in fact you're claiming the problem is the solution.
Right.
So if the help isn't helping, it's an indication that what you're helping yourself to is an idea that you're a big help, when in fact people are hurting. And since it's an addiction, you don't notice the evidence any more than an alcoholic tends to notice the bankruptcy and the bankruptcy of relationships, bankruptcy of fiscal responsibility, bankruptcy of friends, family, employers that occurs in that. They tend not to see that. They tend to blame all those people for being the cause of what they're doing, rather than seeing that they're creating those consequences, because addiction is a reversal. It's an attempt to turn a lie into truth. So enabling is the primary social ill, I would suggest. And so if people who are in charge are diagnosing the problem out there and creating a cure based on an incorrect diagnosis, and that cure continues to lead to people getting worse and dying, if a doctor were to do that, he'd have his license taken and be thrown in jail for involuntary manslaughter or voluntary manslaughter, depending on the degree to which he participated in constantly offering the cure while not having it ever help cure the symptom, while never having it help the disease and actually kill the person in the meantime, which is a good example of what painkillers do.
Right.
People who have pain and then get hooked on them easily succumb to other emotional issues, other struggles they're having, and feel better, but they're actually denying the problem. And by denying the problem continues to get worse while you make believe you're better because you're feeling better. And it takes more and more and more of that feeling to overcome the growing problem that is constantly being fostered by denying that it's actually the source of the problem.
Right.
So that's why we drink more and more and more. We use drugs more and more and more. We eat more and more and more. We do have sex more and more and more. We gamble more and more. We put things at risk more and more, because we're finally trying to get even with being out of balance, naturally admitting that we're actually not in balance, to constantly feel like we need to be in balance. We're not admitting that we're out of balance to constantly need to feel that we need to be in balance. So, but enabling is at the core of it. And I would say that's the standard major social ill, mental ill in society, which has us think if the first billion, the problem gets worse, the imagination is the second billion will fix it.
Yeah.
And so we're offering, more latitude for people to go wrong on the streets. And the irony of getting back to the idea of carrying the message is that most of the people I talk to about it, because that point you made about coming into AA and feeling like you had a place there, when someone suffers from something and actually connects with that person, people go to war, they are better equipped to talk to people who've been to war in terms of a healing process than somebody who's never been to war.
Right.
And if you're going through bankruptcy and you talk to people who've been through bankruptcy, there's a better chance that you have a connection to them because they've actually witnessed it. They have firsthand. They're not talking about it theoretically. They're talking about actually what happened for them. Same with divorce and all the prison, whatever the ailment is that occurs, whatever the problem. And within Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, all the different programs, all the 100 and plus programs, people are uniquely qualified to talk about and help others connect and wake up to the fact that maybe they have a problem that they just simply haven't diagnosed correctly, which is a disease. And if the symptom is capable of being addressed as quickly as it is for most of us, when you finally realize that the thing I'd been struggling with is the idea I had power over something that I had no power or control over. And every time I did it, I proved that I had no control. And yet I kept thinking what I needed to do was do it more.
Yeah.
And found myself in deeper and deeper inability to control it, and never noticed that the evidence never added up because I was maintaining the thought that someday it would get better. Someday it would. It's the same mental illness as when we recover and realize the real core of the disease is a mental problem, not the compulsion, not the attempt to escape that mental problem in a compulsion. So if we're uniquely qualified and the conditions on the street are so horrifying and so disgusting and so the health hazards, the fire hazards, the safety hazards, the allowance of people who are literally felons and criminal, who are predators, who are molesters, who are perverted in some way or another. And in our community in Venice, we've got them all out there having been given what I call blanket immunity. They might need blankets, but we gave them blanket immunity to actually behave worse and actually subject the people who are in need of help and might want help to so much fear that they just get worse and worse and worse being subjected to it. And the conditions make approaching them for any sane person, and I would say sobriety is about sanity, unreasonable and irrational. And it would be correct to see those conditions as warranting that lack of approach. It doesn't mean it's impossible for us as a group to have an effect. And I would suggest that we're probably the only people qualified to have an effect. Certainly social workers with clipboards haven't done a good job yet.
Right.
So I think that's a big conversation and one worthy of note because it's actually close enough and obvious enough and literally the exact same type of people that Alcoholics Anonymous and all the other programs were built on. Exactly the same kind.
I'm visualizing us, you and I, in a room full of unhoused people who are the people that we're talking about that we want to reach, and you talking about mental obsession and me dumbing it down for everybody.
Well, I think the beauty of it is that it doesn't take any intelligence in the thinking form to get that we do have a connective tissue that's very, very present and very aware. And if it weren't for that knowing presence, we wouldn't know what's wrong. We wouldn't feel bad. We wouldn't have these other sensations
right.
that occur to us. So
you would have compassion, not pity.
Yeah, well, and it starts with not having pity for our seeming self, the one that we think we are, and starting to see that if I can be free of the drinking, I can be free of the ideas I have about who I think I am and start to see that who we all are is shared. We're basically sharing the same dynamic. And if we are, we might as well talk about it.
Do you ever have pity, Jack? Self-pity?
Sure.
I can't picture it. Well, you're able
whenever I get irritated, myself is pitiful.
That's good. That's good.
I mean, I see those things pop up because I have certain ideas about how things should go. And when they don't, I kind of stomp my feet a little bit. And I realize that sort of internal urge. And talking about it has helped me realize that I used to think keeping those things to myself was what growing up was about.
Oh, yeah.
Rather than just having a group and saying, you know what? I feel like an idiot a lot because I do idiotic things. I think idiotic thoughts.
Mm.
So the part of the conversation in my term started at the Midnight Mission downtown.
Wow.
And I used to go down on Sundays. I called it Sunday school. And I'd talk to a lot of the guys who were newly in there, and all we'd talk about, and I talked to Clancy about the fact that who ran the Midnight Mission for many, many years, that I didn't talk to him about because he had said, it's really hard to get across to people on the street and to communicate the message to them because they're very resistant and all that. And I said, I know, but the job isn't to try and get them sober. It's to do the best we can to communicate that there is a solution, and that strengthens the attractiveness of the body of AA members, because the potential of that conversation now is in the ears of other people who might not have otherwise heard it. And the experience of people willing to even step into that unlikely role of an unlikely possibility ever being realized actually did that work, regardless of the possibility and regardless of the grade. But I said, Clancy, these guys who are in here have kind of made an admission that they haven't reached the top of the mountain yet. And he said, and when we talked, he said, yeah, you're right. I said, so when I talked to him about his responsibility, he said, well, no group needs more communication about responsibility than these guys, right? Because clearly they did not get here on a high note. But it was interesting in talking to them about it. And all I would do is pose the fact that our struggles are self-induced in what we think, by what we think. And that if we're thinking things that aren't true and we're struggling with them and making believe that we're actually have something to struggle with that has no basis, and we're creating this image, we're preoccupying ourselves with things that aren't happening and neglecting things that are happening. So why would things that are happening go well if that's our preoccupation and condition?
Right.
It's like driving and just not looking at the road and wondering why you keep running into things. It's just, it's just common sense. And I would suggest that ADD is a common diagnosis today because we've cultivated this idea that thinking about things that aren't happening is actually normal. And what we need to do to finally get where we're going, rather than begin to concede that we're already where we are, and we're always where we are, and wherever we end up going will actually be where we are when we end up wherever it is that we think we got. We'll be in the same present state of being and same present now that we are. So ears in that discussion were very open in there because these guys knew their families were at risk, their jobs had been lost, they'd spent their money, their car was gone, their boat was gone, the imagined yacht they thought they were on the verge of getting was gone.
I would love to be there. So what happened to the meeting?
It slowly faded, and then I started having it at the Santa Monica Airport at the back of the Spitfire Grill. They had a little meeting room in the back, and we do it in the morning down there.
Inside the Spitfire Grill?
Yeah.
I used to do a comedy show there.
Yeah. Oh, really?
What a coincidence.
Yeah. And then when COVID started...
So they would go in the Spitfire Grill?
Well, we took that little room in the back that was kind of a little conference room, and
right.
We'd have breakfast and talk.
That's beautiful.
But there was often a lot more contention amongst people who are cultured in AA culture, feeling somewhat offended that some of these thoughts we talk about seem contrary to the culture of sobriety as it's developed, which isn't always following what the book says, but what has eventually been developed over time. And one of those things in meetings has come out of my experience, and I think history has come out of sober living, where there are therapy sessions that are basically group therapy and there's no crosstalk. So crosstalk eventually bled into AA meetings. But in the early days of AA, if people were talking about things that weren't true, people would stand up and say, sit down, shut up, and listen. And they'd stop them. They would just say, look, you want to talk about yourself, go somewhere else. This is about us here. This isn't about you. This is about us. And you were included in this, but if you want to exclude yourself, we're not interested in listening. They bring it back into focus. What's the focus? Principles. What we share, not what we each have individually and think that we can develop. And, the idea that I came into AA to figure out how to refine my ego and manage my ego is a bit contrary to the concept of letting go absolutely.
Right.
And beginning to see that letting go of old ideas absolutely was the term. So sobriety is about rational, sane living. And it is not sane or rational to watch problems get worse and make believe if you keep doing the same thing, they'll get better.
Right.
And in our conversation, the idea of being able to actually talk about that more publicly, where there aren't politics involved in that discussion because it's just open ears actually listening, my sense gives us a chance to empower the people within the AA community, within the NA community, within the DA community, within the SAA community, within all of the communities of people who have recovered from any individual symptom, and realize that their own willingness to surrender is what helped them win that battle. That what didn't come from continuing to fight, it came from, the peace came from the surrender. And the surrender was basically just not thinking anymore that I could control the thing that was clearly out of control, and be open to new ideas, fresh ideas. And that discipline is really an exercise of implementing those ideas to begin to function on the basis of principles that are solid and absolute, rather than new good ideas that were wonky and just big, grandiose, or depressed states of mind attempting to justify through self-pity or through grandiosity and pride that somehow will escape this dilemma, while I'm refusing to actually exist in the moment I'm in mentally. I'm unwilling to admit that the state of my experience is really largely, if not exclusively, caused by my thinking about what's happening, not what's actually happening.
Right. So the discipline, in a lot of ways, is surrendering every day. And
more than the day.
Right. And for me, I protect my sobriety, physical sobriety, like a gem. And I also protect my emotional sobriety. But the emotional sobriety is something I have to work at my physical sobriety every day, but the more I'm sober, the more it becomes more of my emotional sobriety.
Well, and my sense is it's always been about emotional sobriety, because our emotions are reflections of how we see things. If we don't like things, we tend to get angry when things that we don't like don't do things we want them to do. And if we love things, we tend to be a little more giving, a little more compassionate. So our feelings tend to reflect, again, our thinking. And my experience is that our thinking is somewhat like a prism. And if you think of light in its form is white. All colors of light add up to white. But if you subject it to a prism, the prism, through its refraction, separates the wavelengths of that light. And what do we refer to emotions as? Those colors: green, envy, yellow, fear, blue, sadness, red, anger. All those things line up to light. Our thinking very much impacts the way we feel. And if we're not emotionally sober, we're insane. We're literally irrational. We're literally causing our body to feel the self-pity, the grandiosity, the pride, the arrogance, the defensiveness that comes naturally with entertaining ideas that simply have no basis. Under the guise, entertaining an idea with no basis is not the problem. Thinking it's true is the problem. Thinking it's real as a result is the problem. Thinking it needs defense as though it has strength, and not notice that nothing with strength needs defense, only weak things need defense, is sort of what addiction does in thought. But have you ever read Bill Wilson's Emotional Sobriety Letter?
No.
Oh, well, what he talked about is false dependencies. He said he had to cut away false dependencies. And what was he dependent on? Admiration. I mean, he was the guy. He used to go to meetings and say, I'm the only one in the room who can't go to a meeting.
Right. That's
because he was the guy, right? So he got used to the admiration, and those were expectations. And when he didn't get it, he felt angry and hostile and all that kind of stuff. And so expectations, my suspicion is, are just attempts to counter. They're almost demands we make on how things should be to help balance the imbalance we're creating in how we're thinking of those things. But what he said is, when he started to cut away false dependencies, and this is 25 or 30 years into his sobriety, he started to realize what the freedom was. And he was talking about it from a thinking standpoint. And as a result, and he said the pioneers of AA The oldsters, I think he referred to them, will be the pioneers in the future of a new era, something to that degree. And if you go back to the big book, he said, having been granted a perfect release from alcohol, why shouldn't we be able to apply these same, I forget the words he uses, but it was close to principles, in all our problems, or to all our problems? Why shouldn't we be able to apply it to all of our problems? Then I asks, he says, maybe this is the riddle of the universe. And he goes right ahead, as generous as he was, to answer the riddle. Maybe the answer is only in the mind of God, suggesting maybe we're in the mind of God. Maybe the infinite isn't something that we can be away from or disconnected from. Maybe that thing, that infinite, unlimited, absolute, omnipotent, all-powerful essence is where we always are, not some place to get, not some place to go, not some place to have that we don't have, not something we can ever be disconnected from, except by our own imagination and the impact on our body of that imagined thought that isn't true and isn't real, considered to be all that's real and all that's true, because it ends up all we think about, which is what obsessive thinking is.
And so to carry the mission to help what's going on right now, to carry the message of that infinite higher power, how could we do that? Because my suspicion is that people that are struggling with addiction on the street, like, they don't have that connection, but they don't have the connection to people, but also they don't have that connection to a higher power. And if they do have a higher power, I would bet that their higher power is the higher power that I had from Catholic school, that is condemning of them, or that they are forsaken. They are forsaken, like God has forgotten them. God doesn't care about them.
So you have a thought that they can be disconnected.
Right. I don't have that thought, but they
No. You have a thought about them.
That they feel that way.
Yes.
I don't think that they are, but I bet they feel disconnected. And our to 12 step would be to help them feel connected.
Well, focusing more on why they might feel disconnected can go off into trillions and different variations and justifications and stories and histories and interactions and parental misguidance and teachers and, the whole thing. As you know, the stories go on forever, right?
Right.
Or if the focus is on beginning to as I began to really pay attention to the fact that I was seeing them with doubt as being capable of listening. And so what I found were people who were incapable of listening. And what I presented to them, they were incapable of hearing, because I wanted to be sure that whatever my incorrect thoughts were, because I thought they were so right, proved themselves to be right by creating circumstances that justified them. You follow me?
I do.
So when I started seeing that they had it and they were all there, I just go up to them and I'd smile and say, this probably isn't the best you could be doing.
I love that.
It may be right now what you're able to, but I have a feeling you're probably thinking there's other things you could potentially be doing. And they would almost inevitably laugh and kind of wake up a little bit and say, yeah. And then I'd say, where's your mom? I mean, then it kind of came to me, the first discussion I had with somebody when I sort of crossed this threshold and realized I'd really been discounting them all along. And not all of them were interested in talking. But very often, if I came at them with the idea that they wouldn't be interested in talking and I had to find the one that was, I always found the ones that weren't to support, again, the thinking I was doing, right? So sick thinking tends to manifest realities, seeming realities that justify the thinking, when in fact it's not reality at all. It's just a manifestation that I'm only willing to see this small sliver of who I'm talking to support the contention that I have that's wrong, simply because I want to prove I'm right so I can move on and say, yeah, there's just another idiot and I can't get through to him and he's dense and blocked, and yeah, I was that way once, but I am no longer, while I'm doing the exact same thing in my thoughts right now, right? So most of the people would say, well, my mom's in Minneapolis. And I said, do you think she wonders when was the last time you talked to her? 3 months ago. I said, do you think she might wonder where you are? Be concerned? He said, of course, and it would sort of put them against why they're on the street. Most of them have burned the bridges with mom and dad. They're ashamed. They feel guilty. They have friends. They have people. All of them are connected to somebody somewhere. And this disconnect, we treat them as though they have no dignity and no connection when they absolutely are dignified and have a connection. Right. Absolutely. So my sense is that when we each talk about it in more accurate terms and begin to open up, I told you about the meeting I used to have too, on the 12-step meeting, right? And people would say, well, I've been to 12-step meetings. And I said, no, this is a 12th-step meeting. And they said, no, well, I've done the 12 steps. I've been to the 12-step book studies. I said, no, this is a 12-step meeting. They're like, what's that? I said, a meeting about the 12-step. Oh, what's that? Carry the message, practice principles in all our affairs. That's what we talk about. Most of the meeting was spent talking about how hard the message is to carry. Mm. And so I'd let everybody talk. And at the end, I'd say, okay, we just spent 80% of our time talking about the impossibility of carrying the message. So what do? Don't even try. Isn't that the impossibility? Isn't that action the one that causes the impossibility? We're living up to our expectation and our thinking. And the fact is there's opportunities. So I said, just consider during the week, in between this meeting, consider saying hello to somebody. Don't worry about the message. If you can't say hi to somebody, you're not going to carry the message. This isn't a proselytizing missionary position. We're not trying to sell somebody anything. So one guy came back and he said he was going to the Valley to speak at a meeting, a Pacific Group meeting. And he was in a suit and went to a 7-Eleven before the meeting to get a Coke. And he said some homeless guy opened the door for him. And he said, the homeless guy said to him, where are you going? And he said, my first thought was to lie and not tell him. And he said, and I found that interesting. So I said, I'm going to an AA meeting. I'm speaking at an AA meeting. The guy said, hang on a second. And he held the door and he ran off and he came back with a big book from his backpack.
Wow.
And another guy in Shane in Santa Monica said that he'd been passing it. I said, you have passed people on the street that you haven't even bothered to acknowledge for years probably, and just thought of them as wasted impossibilities. I said, just say hello. So he saw a guy and he said, sure enough, I'd seen this guy I've denied him, ignored him. And he said, hello. And the guy stood up. He said, what's your name? I said, ask him their name. Start there. And the guy stood up like he was at attention, like he was saluting somebody. And he reached out and he gave him his hand. He said, my name's so-and-so. And he had been in the military. And he was so thankful that anybody even gave him the time of day to even say hello to him. And he said, from that point on, the guy slowly started opening up to him. I said, yeah, relationships are built. That doesn't just, somebody's not going to wake up and say, oh yeah, you're from, yeah, let me go to a meeting. I want to go. There's no connection there in that. There's no message in that. There's no love in that. The love is not having somebody do what we think they should be doing. The love is being able to allow them to do exactly what they're doing and still continue to give them support and love.
Now I'm gonna play devil's advocate with you, and it's not something that you are not aware of because you've experienced it yourself, but a friend of mine was recently giving a sandwich to somebody on the street, and while he was giving somebody a sandwich, somebody over here stabbed him.
Yeah. No, I am not suggesting that it's safe in all situations to do that.
But what's interesting is you had an awakening from your situation, and my friend did too.
Yeah. Well, I realized
he's a completely different person, to be honest.
No, it helped me enormously. It's really what helped me clarify what help was.
Yeah.
And, I don't know, you're mentioning the fact that about 15 years ago, there had been a guy in the neighborhood who was very edgy, and I didn't realize he was probably on meth because I'd never had any experience with meth, but he was living in the alley and I gave him a little latitude and kind of, we live in a neighborhood where you make the best out of situations that are not always good. And I did what I could to help him and not overdo it, but eventually he tried to blow up one of the neighbors' cars. And I said to him, I'm not helping you so that you can cause problems in the neighborhood. I'm helping you to give you a little bit of leeway and a little bit of room to, his teeth were rotting and he was in pain all the time. I said, I'll pay to get your teeth done if you go to the clinic on Lincoln where the UCLA has a dental clinic. If you go down there and couldn't figure that out. So I said, okay, well, that's your choice. You don't have to go. And eventually, as he tried to blow the car up because the guy had asked him not to use the laundry, I said, look, I cannot support you and help you if that's the way you're going to behave. And he said, well, I know how to take care of guys like you. And I said, you may, but I will stand my ground. And, a week later, he came back and slit my throat and put a 9-inch knife in my back and stabbed me 3 times in the chest and almost killed me, except for the fact that the soft edge of the knife went up against my vena cava and the spine and, never caused any damage internally. So I walked back to that place where he did that 5 days later from the hospital and completed the walk I'd started that day so that he wasn't able to interfere with my plan for the day. But it helped me see that I'd been helping myself to the idea I was helping when he was getting a psychotic idea that I was his savior. And when I all of a sudden withdrew my support, I became the enemy. I became the devil. I became all of the things that he feared in his own psychosis. And I am not suggesting anyone subject themselves to conditions or situations that are risky, but that there are situations that are not risky, and there are people who are being overlooked, and people we could certainly say hello to 10 feet away that don't have other people in their midst that would allow for a little conversation. And I would also subject the policies of the city of Los Angeles, especially because I live in the city of Los Angeles and am in Venice, to look at what they've done to actually create an environment where the most capable people to help these people have basically been marginalized and neutralized in their own willingness because of the health threats and the safety threats and the fire hazards and the absolute conditions that have been deplorable by any stretch of, if any of us as citizens lived the way that they have allowed those people to live, or had anyone on our premises living that way, we would be arrested for human abuse in some form or another. And to think of this as somehow a compassionate, helpful end is to show how sick thinking can go and how far it goes in trying to confirm itself while ignoring all of the evidence to the contrary, the overdoses and the deaths and the violence and the assaults, the armed assaults, the burglaries, the car thefts, the fires, the arson, it just goes on and on and on. And it's anybody who mentions it and talks about it is considered a right-wing conspiracist or some sort of extremist. And it doesn't take a lot for the citizens of any city to notice when something's wrong, because they're living there all the time. They see it, they recognize it. And a city has an obligation, like any municipal authority, to protect its citizens and protect the people within its bounds, not one group against another. That would be exactly the idea that they're trying to overcome by claiming that this one group of people has been marginalized, when a lot of the people living in our streets have been invited from cities around the country that have low-income housing, where they can't afford housing. So they come to LA, one of the more expensive cities in the country. What would the expectation be? Well, we've given it to them, a new condo. Hang out on our streets, buy a tent, and if you can, with no qualifications other than a tent, you get a house. And the irony is most of the people on our streets would not qualify for that housing because they're not interested in abiding by any rules. I don't know, I might say most, because so many of them seem so obviously flagrant in my neighborhood and are largely drug addicted and alcoholic and not interested in help. They're interested in doing what they want to do at everyone else's expense. So it's an interesting political, social situation to show how the same kind of thinking that an addict does is actually being employed to serve the population of largely addicts and alcoholics that is living on the street. And then everybody's got their arms up wondering why it's not working. It's very clear. The people who are most qualified are people who have already recovered.
Right.
They can bear witness and stand as evidence to the success and the potential of recovery. And that communicates to people, just like being able to start seeing that that person also is never disconnected. They can think all they want. They can think lunacy all they want. They can think as crazy as they want, and they're not disconnected any more than you and I are.
Right.
And when we start
Beautiful.
conceding that, we start having an intuitive sense of how to approach people, because the connection of knowing between us becomes more obvious rather than the connection of understanding, attempting to overcome their misunderstanding. And if I am attempting to take someone who's irrational and get a rational response from them, I am the insane person in the pair.
Right.
Because they're not
Right.
struggling.
It's like talking to our disease thinking.
Yes. And thinking there's somebody to talk to. I mean, think of the sentence, I am talking to myself. That means there's an I and a self in the same sentence. So I'm
Right.
clearly schizophrenic in my own concept of the discussion I'm having.
Right.
Right? Who am I talking to? And if I was actually talking, I'd be talking to somebody else. But I'm actually having a conversation with something that's imagined and wondering why I can never sort the conversation out. Wondering why it keeps going on and on and on. Wondering why I'm embarrassed and shy and feel guilty and ashamed and don't like public speaking. I've been talking, my mastery of speaking is talking to a self that doesn't exist. And if I start talking openly, I might be exposed for not being able to speak very well.
That might be funny to speak it and just keep talking to yourself and then be like, oh, wait, and then go back.
Well, for me, you probably heard the story, but when I started writing about this more every morning, I'd get up at 6 and walk over to the local Great White, the coffee shop, and they'd make me an espresso or two, and I'd write for 2 or 3 hours. And on my way over there one morning, I saw a guy walking, talking to himself out loud. And I said to myself, he's crazy. And then I thought, who's crazy here? He's talking out loud. At least he's talking within earshot that I'm able to hear. And I'm talking about him to myself.
Ooh, I love that.
All alone, thinking I have a moral high ground in determining his sanity. And I said, that's crazy. And that's me crazy right there.
Right.
That's the ideas I have about crazy. And then I thought, he's actually doing a fifth step. So he's talking out loud, he's sharing it. And what am I doing? Harboring my own ideas and thoughts and contentions and all that kind of stuff about him. How is that helpful? What's that? Disconnected in terms of my relationship to him, because I'm seeing him not as he is, I'm seeing him as I think he is.
Right.
And the sense of disconnection comes from that type of interaction and interreactiveness caused by the ideas I have about who I think I am being employed in relation to who everybody else is, when how I see everyone else is colored by the ideas I have about who I think I am in all cases. There's no way to escape that when it's an obsessive. And yet I'm never in it any more than my chronic commitment to the maintenance of it, which is where the mental obsession comes back into play. And the fact is, it's delusional. It's all made up. It shows what imagination is capable of doing on the destructive end, rather than being able to say, oh, if I just start imagining things as they seem to be in an absolute sense, which seems preposterous to any reason, which to reason it should be preposterous, because reason is constantly trying to justify whatever it's doing by causing manifesting circumstances to support it. If it's capable of doing that, then it's probably not going to be very happy to face something that's absolutely unlimited and makes no sense to reason. And so the preposterous nature of it is actually the confirmation that I'm starting to consider it and contemplate it accurately, because my thinking begins to fall apart and starts to relax and say, oh, I'm not designed to conclude that. I'm not the designer that's trying to conclude it through understanding. I've been designed to simply express it because I know it. And that's what my thinking is for. So the imagination in that contemplation and consideration is used, I would say accurately, for its highest purpose rather than its lowest purpose. One is a constant expansion, and then the realization that an infinite source doesn't even expand. So if I'm always expanding, I'm always limiting it to some degree. It just grows, which is better than contracting and finding it comes to this end where the only thing I can think about is trying to kill the self I think I am, because it just won't shut up. And I think it's doing it to me when in fact I'm the culpable source of constantly relying on it to come to a conclusion. And the conclusion is there's nothing there. So what do I want to do? Which people say, people who kill themselves kill the wrong person.
Right.
They're killing the thinking of who they are, not actually who they are. So this isn't a medical prescription for anyone listening. This is just simply experience and awareness on a level that is, I suspect, worthy of discussion, capable of being discussed, and more than a right to be discussed if it's actually happening. If we're doing it and keeping it quiet and not talking about it, I would say if we have the right to do it and be destructive, we certainly have the right to talk about it openly without a license of any sort or an academic qualification, just based on experience.
It's interesting to me that when I shared about my friend that also had an awakening, he's like, I'm like, I'm so sorry you were stabbed. And he was like, it's fine. He's like, I'm totally awake. And I could feel his energy shift. Like I never really, hope he doesn't listen to this. I'm sure, well, because he's awakened, I'm sure it's fine. I didn't really want to hang out with him before. And now I feel like I want to hang out with him all the time.
Well, you can feel the openness.
His energy is completely shifted.
But that, I would say, is exactly the difference between approaching somebody on the street with an awareness, with a willing awareness, a ready awareness to say they're perfectly intact.
Right.
And the worse they are, it's greater proof to their nature of being intact, because that just proves how long they've been relying on thinking the thinking would eventually get them to the place they needed to be to get better. And all the excuses they use and the stories they tell and the trauma they've suffered and all that kind of stuff is being reinforced by the trauma they're creating in the present by making believe those stories will someday become true. It starts to become apparent that, oh, this isn't something we're all doing individually, and it's different because the faces and the places and the times that we associate to the stories we tell are different. This is all the exact same thing built on the exact same weak platform that somehow there's a story that can be told about who I think I am. And one day it'll be true if I just keep repeating it and refining it and arguing for it and pretending I'm not doing it so that I can, pretense becomes my state. And what is that? Appearance. It's how things look, not how things are, how things seem, not how they are, how they feel, not what we're thinking. We're looking at it as the effect only, not the cause. And the cause of the thinking is where the problem lies. So that awareness is, we're aware of it. We know it. We know it. We feel it. We sense it. We know something's wrong. And it's not always with us if it's not with everyone. We're sharing that experience. We're witnessing it. Wherever we go, we sense it. We sense what's going on. And where I have thoughts that align with those thoughts I'm sensing, I react to them as though they're somehow distinct from me, rather than seeing that I'm reacting from the same basis that's causing the reaction. The interaction is no longer an interaction, it's an interreaction, it's a fight. It's a sense of contention and a sense of protection, defensiveness, irritation.
In that TED Talk, he talked about the conditions that, like the rat with the cocaine, that was in like the sterile cage and had water that was just water and water that was just cocaine, how it kept going to the cocaine one. And then they did an experiment where there was a rat cage where the rat had the same exact water bottle, regular water and cocaine, but the rat cage was a heavenly. It was like a park. There were other rats to hang out with, and their needs were met. Like it was a beautiful place to be, and the rat did not go to the cocaine water. So in that sense, like people on the street who, like right now during the pandemic, during the lockdown, people were given money by the government. They made more with that limited amount of money than they do when they're working. So, I mean, it's just a frustrating rat race. And
good term.
So how can we create? I don't think we can create that loving environment. I think, I mean, we could, but I think
what if it already exists?
At first, right. And it
What
first
if it
starts
exists?
with the rat thinking like Frankel, that was in the concentration camp, how he thought they can take away everything, but they can't take away my mind. And then he started picturing himself giving a talk on what he had just realized, and that saved him. So giving people some these tools that what Frankel went through, and the you know, these rats, they got the beautiful. How can we change the thinking in the rats that don't have the option of that beautiful cage?
Well, my sense is, and what we talk about in our weekly Sunday discussion, is that when we're focused on absolute principles and absolute concepts, we start stabilizing the thinking that allows us to recognize that that interconnectedness is always ever present and always the same for all of us and is not different for anyone. And if I'm simply thinking about how to mechanically induce that, I'm missing the fact that it's already done. The love is there, the support is there. All that's happening, it reduces. Think of the rat in the cage who was alone.
Mm-hmm.
He only had one option. What's that? Addiction. Addiction is the thought that the only option is the worst option. I can't do anything else. I have to do this. When the rat only had one option, what did he choose? That option. When all of a sudden he had family, friends, interactions, all kinds of stuff, he thought, like, getting sober, by the way, getting sober is largely realizing that choice always includes the right not to choose. So when I admit that I'm powerless over something that I feel like has me, like I thought alcohol was my problem, I thought drugs were my problem was thinking that I could start using them and then control them and enjoy them and still manage to live a life that was valuable and useful. And every time I tried them, I would prove that I wouldn't go to work, I'd be hungover, I wouldn't be effective, I wouldn't be efficient, I wouldn't be happy, I'd do more to solve the problem again. So when I have recovered, I've really regained perspective. I've regained the idea that, yes, I can drink any day. I'm free. I can drink, but I know now what the consequences are. With the rat, all of a sudden he's thinking, yeah, I could do that, but I got 100 other things going on here that I could do too. Regain perspective because he was reintroduced to a community that he was always connected to, but the scientists isolated him. And by the way, I'll write the name of Johan Hari and the YouTube thing in the comments for anybody listening, so you can go listen to that too, because it was very interesting in his social experiment and his investigation that there were things that could be done to actually help accommodate and increase the chance of people getting better. And none of those things included helping people get worse by having them live in more and more derelict conditions. None of it. It all included offering them ideas and thoughts and a little money to help them do what they'd like to do and start to foster some sense of productivity and usefulness for them before they started saying, oh, yeah, I don't need to. And all of a sudden reintroduce them to the population. Our thinking has caused this problem, and it's a pandemic of another sort that's going to continue as long as the thinking is continued to be relied on that created the problem. This has been going on. The Midnight Mission was built in downtown Los Angeles in 1914.
Wow.
It was rebuilt, I believe, in the 1980s or 90s, as it is today. But the Weingart Center that's across from that area in downtown has been a problem from the beginning and has never been solved. There's people been on the streets down there. And now basically they just said, well, Skid Row has failed so miserably. Let's just apply that as the failure to the whole city. Why not? So that same thinking, just like an addict would think, the best thing I can do is the worst thing, is evident in exactly what the policies are that have led there. Not pointing at anyone individually, but pointing at policies, which are results of thought, as being the problem. So my sense is, as we get better talking about it on a broader scale, we get more influential in the connection we have with people who are even willing to listen to us, who aren't living on the streets, but have some authority to make decisions about how things are being done, that all of a sudden get things done in a way that actually help those people out there, rather than give them the impression that giving them more and more latitude to go wrong is the greatest help we can give them, rather than just starting to bring in the limits a little bit and encourage people to start to think about right and wrong, rather than say, no, you can go as wrong as you want. Nobody's going to do a thing to you. You have absolute freedom, and somehow that freedom's better. In San Francisco, they raised the amount of money that people on the street got. They gave a whole district to people who want to use drugs. And if you go online, you can see this. I think it's in the Tenderloin. And they gave them free needles. What happened? Things got worse. Why wouldn't they? They're fostering that. What happened was, because they as a county were giving them more money every month, people from the surrounding counties moved to San Francisco to get $80 more a month, or $100, or whatever the difference was, because they could buy more drugs with it. They weren't interested in getting better as a result of it. So when you're contributing to someone's delinquency, you're actually helping kill them, and you become complicit in that. And in the law, if you were to participate in a robbery where somebody died, you would be held responsible for the murder. And yet this is going on publicly, and we're talking about it as though it's some kind of compassionate thing. And anybody who talks about it in any way that's maybe progressive enough to actually make progress is somehow isolated as an antagonist to the problem. And I don't think, as sober members of a city, we have any obligation to be quiet about sober issues. We do not have any obligation to announce ourselves publicly at press, radio, or film and internet that we're members of Alcoholics Anonymous, unless we're anonymous, which we do in this podcast for that reason. But it does not mean we need to be quiet as citizens and all of a sudden disqualify ourselves from being representative of a population of people that clearly knows better what could be done that isn't being done.
This is for me. I have always, I talked to God about it, or whoever. It was even before I got sober, that I would never go past a woman on the street without offering money, and it wasn't my business if they got drugs or whatever with it. I just couldn't imagine being a woman on the streets. It's 10 million times worse, I think, than for men. But in having this conversation, I feel that maybe it would be better for me to have a conversation with the women on the street. I always give money and I say, God bless you. And to be honest, they always say, God bless you to me before I give them the money. But not always, but really 99% of the time.
Listen, they're fully intact. If they can survive the struggle they've been struggling, there is evidence of fortitude and strength and durability to go through that. They're asking, literally crying for help, and what they're getting is help to get them worse. Yeah. They're not getting the connective tissue, the concern, the regard. And my sense is what you just suggested, and actually just saying hello, is a reminder that they're part, because that, like, in the relationships you have, we had dinner last Friday night, those little periods of time that we get to spend together with a half a dozen people who didn't all know each other are the high points of the week. They're like little meetings, and it's always fun. And there's always more revealed. What I always find with people is, no matter what I think about them, whenever I spend time with them, there's more to them than I thought, always. And that exploration is ultimately the adventure of what we are here to do, as far as I can tell, is to step into that and step into a broader concept of it and begin to remember that the horizon is always the beginning of everything else. And the limits of my thought as a horizon are not the end of anything, they're the beginning of all the rest. So what I'm thinking about people on the street, when I can communicate, gives them that thread of memory of saying, oh yeah, I like being connected to people. I like interacting with people and not constantly being ignored and all that stuff. And I'm not taking away their responsibility by claiming it's only our responsibility, because as far as I'm concerned, they are living their level of responsibility, and irresponsible actions are very much what got them to exactly where they are. Isn't to say there aren't holes in society, because I would say there's a lot. But if the individual is excused from doing what they're doing, society is not doing any good in helping them. They're actually helping them get worse in the name of thinking that there's nothing that can be done but what we think should be done for them, rather than having, they all have a guidance system capable of having kept them alive enough to be available today to even talk to.
Right.
And they are subjected to people who are not particularly homeless, but are robbers and thieves and violent predators that are out there that subject them 24 hours a day to peril that does not help their mental condition at all, nor would it help yours and mine.
Right.
So,
right. I love that. This has helped me a lot.
Well, and the ultimate goal is to realize we are part of a community of people and to talk about this openly, like you're speaking on Friday, just to mention that there's greater possibility than we imagine, but that doesn't mean we have to be risky in any of the possibility we take. It doesn't mean we have to go somewhere that would be unwise. But certainly people sitting outside of publicly a door that's people are coming and going, you can always say hello to. What's your name? It's amazing what happens when you ask people their name.
Oh, yeah.
It just it kind of, and give them your name too, and cross that thread. Katie and I were in New York once at 57th and Park, I think, which is a pretty wealthy neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And there was a guy in the corner who was asking for money, and I said to him, "If you have change for 100, I'll give you a 5." And he pulled out about $800 out of his pocket. He said, "I have 6 kids." He says, "I got to be successful." And he was really entertaining and fun and really had people sort of wrapped. And how the crosswalks are there. There's 20 people.
I wonder if it was my same guy. Did he have a red hat?
I don't remember.
I had a guy that I loved. He one time yelled out, I need $20. I'm in a hurry. And I was just like, and I would watch him. He would just say the funniest things when people walk by.
We have an abundant nature that is only made scarce by scarce thoughts. Mm-hmm. Nature doesn't diminish itself, but by the actions we take on those scarce thoughts, do we pollute it, contaminate it, and limit its ability to produce exactly what it's designed to produce. And nature left alone, when we damage it, generally corrects a lot quicker than the things we do to try to fix it, almost always.
Right.
And so our challenge, I would say, is beginning to explore that we have that we know better.
Right.
Or we wouldn't know what's wrong. And knowing what's wrong is a guidance system that we can either learn from or think we need to get over because we don't like the feeling. And if we don't like the feeling, we're claiming we're not having the thought, to make believe that the feeling is the essence of what we need to avoid. We're trying to deny the thought and thinking that how we feel isn't completely and immediately tied to what we're thinking. The greatest impact on our feelings is what we think. And it doesn't mean things out there in the world aren't disturbing and troubling. But if we're thinking about them only as troubling and disturbing and not seeing the essence of them as something that we're actually a part of, we're thinking of them in ways that they don't exist. And so we're actually creating the disharmony that we're witnessing and experiencing in our own experience and our feelings. And so talking about it, in my estimation, gives us a chance to see what we normally would keep to ourselves and think that somehow not sharing it makes us better because we'd be seen as worse to admit it, when in fact, by being seen as worse gives everyone a chance to admit we're all doing it to some degree. We're all participating in that in some degree. We have not functioned collectively as a species yet to feed all the people in the world at the same time. We've been at war 92% of the human written modern history. There's some indication that something's been gnawing at us that isn't right enough to allow us to float the boat in a way that helps it get to a port that everybody can share and benefit from.
So I'm thinking, in speaking with somebody who's living on the streets, I can say, so I could say I have been where they are because I had that limited thinking, even though I haven't lived on the streets.
Well, you've been on the streets. You just have had a house in between.
Yeah.
I mean, we share the streets. That's the one thing in a city that especially we have in common is that we're using them constantly to get to and fro and all that stuff. And the thinking doesn't require you live on the streets to understand what that would mean, because some of us, I slept in a car one night on Mulholland that was a rental car because I was embarrassed to go tell my friends how far down I'd gone. I stayed with a guy that asked me to house sit for his house for 2 weeks, and I stayed for probably 3 months. And he's just pleading with me. And I said, I just have no place to go. I have no money. I have no, and he was generous enough to allow that to happen. And, then I got my first little, got a little bit of legs under me. And so my sense is that the conditions we're sharing, or that we're keeping to ourselves in terms of the mental conditions that we don't always talk about, we're sharing completely. And to the degree that people are on the streets, they are manifestations of our own bankrupt ideas that we're allowing to continue. And we're immediately and directly not only responsible, we're creating it to help give ourselves perspective, to start to see things more accurately by starting to admit things that are happening as a consequence of what we're thinking, rather than some strange curse or byproduct or coincidence, and not realize that even the word coincidence is coinciding. It's simultaneous. It's happening now. It's synchronous. It's not what could happen. It's what is happening as a result of what we have been thinking and what we're continuing to think now, if it's continuing to happen. So there are some new thoughts coming online, and there's an election coming up, and elections tend to spur a lot of very creative thinking, surprisingly.
It's terrifying. Okay, it's not terrifying. I just let my wrong head think.
Well, no, you could listen. I would say that if the population of people who feel interested in voting is so low, it's a pretty good indication that people don't have a lot of confidence in having anything ever really changing. And if we're living in a political system that's free, and we feel condemned even in the one thing that gives us that sense of freedom, which is voting, it's a pretty good indication that we've become numb and apathetic to our ability to actually make a difference. Because the difference which seems to be made is just this perpetuation of ideas that somebody says everything they need to get elected, and then when they get in office, they do everything they want to, contrary to what they said, simply for the purposes of serving the people and the interests that they're now in the center of. And that sort of wheelhouse is the problem, I don't think, is with them doing that. The problem is with us not being awake enough and willing enough to say, we're responsible for all those choices that we make, and making believe that somehow one individual is going to make the difference, and then spend 4 years blaming them for what they're doing. The one individual doesn't work. All of us participate in democracy. Everyone in the world is participating in democracy to the degree that they're making choices right now. Those choices are being...
What if you ran for president?
I'd run from it quickly.
Oh, man.
No, that wouldn't be my job. I think people are specifically qualified for that. And Plato, I think it was, talked about having, how did he call them? What did he call them? Like philosopher kings, who were people who were really educated to think in terms of the public benefit in the actions they took. Marcus Aurelius was, I believe, probably one of the closer individuals, who I believe was a general in the army or some high-ranking military professional. But he wrote a book called, I believe it's Meditations, and had incredible insight in terms of the society and in terms of the failure of government to serve that society. And as a result, grew from that and developed ideas that were, I would say, brilliant, because they expressed the light we all share. And my sense is that we often fail as communities to talk about the problems in our communities accurately. And thus we rely on one individual somewhere to do it all and fix it. And if they don't do it, we're pissed with them, and not realize that it's our own inactivity and our own accurate participation that's ultimately causing this lopsided weight to shift in their direction, rather than seeing that we're all standing as members of those decisions being made. It's like the timbers of a building all need to work together for the structure to stand strong and tall and long. And I don't think we do that well. I don't think we've conversed well as a population. I don't think we've been honest as a population. And to the degree that we aren't, we have defective consequences, social ills to show for it. And I suspect we could get better quickly by simply opening the discussion up and talking about it more accurately and honestly and openly, and
Right, absolutely.
realize that apathy, I don't believe, is really apathy. It's just a numbness that sets in from people who just want to be productive. They don't want to engage in a level that seems to be impossible to have any real long-term impact. So they go home and be productive in their own worlds, in their own seeming lives that seem separate from the rest. And they're not separate. So simply considering these ideas is a beginning of seeing that the potential we have to express it comes from the contemplation of it and the meditation of it, the awakened meditation, and realizing that the possibility of it has always been possible. We just haven't thought it was. And it means that we probably haven't even thought of what's possible yet, when in fact it's always been possible. We've just been limiting what we think is possible to our limited thoughts. And they're self-serving and self-imposed and self-induced in a way that just continues to have these ideas about who we think we are rather than who we actually are.
So that would be something to engage in conversation about unlimited thinking.
Well, that would be an ever-present knowing nature that I would say is what we already know and what gives us the indication. If we didn't know it, and this isn't the type of knowing that's thinking, it's just knowing. It's a present state of knowing, which would be at perfect peace and perfect harmony, and there is no change in it, so it never changes, and no matter what I think about it, it stays the same. So that would be knowing. And if thinking concedes that, then we begin to introduce to thinking the essence of life and the essence of who we are as a species, and nature and everything in the universe simultaneously becomes part of the same thing rather than distinct, separate entities trying to carve out a unique world when that world's already been carved out for us. We're standing on it. We're sharing the gravity. We're rotating around the sun. We're getting all of the benefits that were provided, breathing and water and all of the necessary elements of life. And the difference between reactiveness and responsiveness is that responsiveness is responsibility. It's actually responding to what's happening rather than reacting in a defensive, predetermined way to protect something that's been chronically maintained and gives the impression of reality because the pain of it has been noticed for so long and the trauma of it has been held for so long that we think it must be real to hurt so much, when in fact we're inducing that pain to simply justify it as real, when in fact pain in nature indicates something is wrong. It's not there to prove reality. It's there to point out that we're doing something wrong, that something needs attention. So this discussion is about that and just beginning to open it up. And my sense is if it's natural for us, the conversation will come naturally, but it hasn't come quickly in my experience. There seems to be a lot of resistance and reticence, but I think that actually just helps. It's just an exposure of the reactive tendency that's been developed as what we consider to be normal, when in fact it's abnormal to constantly be on guard and defensive and reactive and protective and irritated by things because they aren't quite what we think they should be.
Perfect peace.
Yes.
Thank you for a beautiful podcast.
Thank you very much. You're very welcome.
I'm going to be excited to re-listen. This has been really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I love you and I appreciate your time very much and your involvement. And I look forward to hearing you on Friday night.
That's going to
Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, everybody. We love you.